Hello, my name is Dr. David Riley, and in this online mini lecture we'll be covering reliability and validity issues, particularly as they apply to surveys. So I'm just going to give you a very brief overview of the concept of reliability, and most of it will be assumed knowledge, so I won't belabor the point, but I want to move very quickly to the reason why reliability is an issue in your survey. And I think this is something that is rather poorly understood by most researchers and certainly most full-year psychology trained graduates. So we're going through very briefly methods of establishing reliability. So stability over time, across versions of a test or a survey, across consistency approaches, internal consistency approaches, and among score approaches, particularly if you've got some subjective type of evaluation and you're evaluating open-ended responses or paragraphs. How are you going to know that your scores are consistent? We're covering the concept of validity, and this is absolutely crucial if you're using existing scales as part of your survey, but it's absolutely crucial, even to a greater extent, if you're developing new scales to be included on your survey, because you want people to be able to evaluate the psychometric properties of your instruments. We'll cover methods of establishing validity, so content validity, criterion validity, and most importantly here, construct validity. We'll also be covering factor analysis. Factor analysis is increasingly an important part of psychology, so I won't actually go through and show you how to do a factor analysis, but I'll point out some of the things that you can learn from a factor analysis, particularly if you're creating new items. So consistency across time is the easiest, what we call test-retest reliability. Of course, this assumes that for your instrument, the construct you're measuring actually is stable. So if the construct remains unchanged, like a personality trait, then a similar score will be observed now, in a day from now, in a year from now, barring any, unforeseen accidents or strokes of luck like winning the lottery. So the correlation between time 1 and time 2 should be extremely high. This is particularly important if you're going to do a longitudinal survey, because you want to make sure that any change that's observed is not down to the properties of the instrument, but rather an actual change in the underlying trait. Now, if the construct being measured frequently changes, like a temporary state such as stress, then test-retest reliability will not be suited. Now, people may change or learn or grow or decline over time, so the longer the time passes, the test-retest reliability is going to be lower. Anything greater than 6 months is termed the coefficient of stability. It's also subject to practice and familiarity effects. I've said here especially ability tests, but it's even observed in personality tests as well. You're less likely to misunderstand the items, and you're more likely to report, stronger endorsement of the items. So if you're doing multiple waves, let's say you're doing across 5 time points and you're measuring them every 2 weeks in your survey, that's going to be problematic. So you need to factor that into consideration. You would expect, a slight increase just over time, so you might want to have a control group that doesn't receive the intervention. You'll have to excuse me coughing from time to time. I'm losing my voice and very ill at the moment. But fortunately, I really like talking about psychometric and statistics, so for me, it's still kind of cool. So consistency across different versions of the test or the scale. So what we call alternate or parallel forms of reliability. There are times, for example, where you will want to, particularly if you're doing lots of measurements, use a different version of the instrument in your survey. You may also want to use a brief version of the scale after you've done a more in-depth assessment. So your initial testing might use the 60 or 100 item version, and then your repeating surveys waves, they might just use the 20 item. So you want to consider alternate or parallel forms reliability by consulting the literature of the scale manufacturer. So how it works is we have test A or survey A or instrument A, and then we have form B, and we just look for the bivariate correlation between the two. Pretty easy. So it's the degree to which different versions of a test or a measure that's employed on the scale correlate. It's handy if the test content becomes known. So the MMPI, for example, is widely available on the internet. For my psychometric assessment students, I always show them how easy it is to do a Google search, and within 2 minutes I can always invariably locate a copy of the scale. In the context of an ability testing, maybe someone sneaks out with an exam or takes a photo of your survey and then decides to practice for it. So particularly, if it's like the depression, anxiety, stress scale in your survey, if you suspect malingering, they might actually coach themselves to the answers. But the even more advanced clinical scales, like the MMPI-2, it took me all of 10 minutes to locate all of the test items, and I didn't even need to go to the dark web. So a lot of personality questionnaires, if you just type the name of the questionnaire into Google and add something like .pdf afterwards or .doc, you can often find entire copies of questionnaires that really shouldn't be available. So obviously an ethical obligation for you is test security, but you need to be worried about whether the instruments that you use are already widely available and whether people have access to it. Of course, it's very expensive and time-consuming to develop two versions of a test. The one exception is when you're coming up with a briefer version of the test, you're actually reducing items so that it's not too much of an ordeal, and you'll often find multiple versions of a survey, an instrument, or a personality scale that you can employ. Alright, consistency across individual items of a test. Now, this is, I suspect, what most people think of when they conceive of reliability. It's internal consistency. The one thing that every student knows is Cronbach's alpha. So it's the degree to which different items comprising a test or a measure correlate with each other. And it's based on inter-item consistency. Now, there's several ways to measure it. I won't go into these in too much detail, but there's split half reliability, where you take one half of the test and you compare it to the other half. And Cronbach's alpha, what it actually does, it does every possible combination of split half reliabilities to calculate your internal consistency rating. Fortunately, it's done on computer. It's incredibly fast, and you never need to worry about the actual details. So if you don't like stats, you can probably forget it. But if you have a true-false scale, and you're using that in your survey, you should actually use the Kuder-Richardson 20 or KR20. Most test developers, though, if they don't understand psychometrics, will just report the Cronbach's alpha. But it actually uses a different formula for calculation. Here's a tip when you're coming up with new survey items. Internal consistency is influenced by its length. So the fewer the items, the less reliable. Imagine if you've got 50 items. If there's 1 or 2 items that are tapping a different construct, it's going to be so diluted it's not going to matter. If you've got 10, then one item can really strongly influence it and dramatically lower your reliability. So when you do your reliability analysis as an SPSS, don't just rely on the publisher. You've always got to report your sample's reliability. But what you can do is you can tick a box that says scale if item deleted. And if that Cronbach's alpha increases dramatically, that's a good clue to drop that item. But once you go below 10, you're really starting to run into problems. So 7 probably be the lower limit. 3, 4, and 5, you will have relatively low reliability. Even if the individual items are good, if you just select any 3 of them, you will find that the reliability coefficient will be much lower. Most researchers will simply report Cronbach's alpha, which is more than sufficient. The one exception being, of course, your Cuda-Richardson if you've got dichotomous items like a binary forced choice. So now we come to good old Cronbach's alpha. It's developed by Cronbach in 1951. Coefficient alpha was its original name, but in honour of the man, Cronbach's alpha is the preferred way to report it. Conceptually, it means it represents the mean of all possible split half coefficients. So like a correlation coefficient, Cronbach's alpha is typically reported as a number between 0, so there's no similarity, and 1. Now, when you're doing your survey analysis and you're running the scales, if you get a negative number, or even worse, you get a dummy split and SPSS refuses to calculate it, chances are you've got reverse coded items there, negatively worded items, and you just haven't done the reverse coding yet. So that's often a good clue as to what's going on in your survey. Now, as the number of items drop on the final instrument due to poor items that are removed, reliability decreases, and as I said, you want at least 3 to 4 good items for acceptable reliability, 0.5, 0.6. For research level, you really want a Cronbach's alpha of 0.7, so you're going to need 7 or 8 items, and if it's high-stake testing, then you're going to need more items and higher reliability. More items are generally better than fewer, but it's a time efficiency trade-off, particularly if you're measuring lots of constructs on your survey, then you need to consider the amount of time it's going to take. Now, you may have come across various rules of thumb. For example, alpha should be 0.70. The criteria you use depends on the context and the purpose for which the test is employed. Higher stakes testing requires a higher standard. So if you're making decisions about individuals, 0.90. Those high stake testing. Do you hire this person or not? Do they have a clinical disorder or not? But when we're talking about survey research, often we're comparing different groups. So males and females, salaried employees compared to part-timers. We might be comparing clinical to non-clinical. So when we're doing group decisions, we want to aim for an alpha of about 0.80. If you're just doing research into basic processes, is there an association between two constructs? So maybe between employee satisfaction and job productivity. Then for something like that, you can go for a lower Cronbach's alpha. It's less, there's less high stakes involved. Anything less than 0.70 introduces too much noise into the data. Why is that a problem? Well, it means you need a larger sample size to be able to reject the null hypothesis. Now, once you have high reliability, there's very little to be gained by increasing beyond that point. Strider 2003 notes if they're too highly correlated, then this indicates redundancy and some items might be removed for time or efficiency. So if you find that you've got a very, very long scale that you want to include in your survey, or if it happens to be your first time and you're creating the items, you might want to do a little bit of pilot testing, identify the redundant items and just sweep them away. But for most purposes, internal consistency will be suitable unless you're doing longitudinal designs, in which case parallel forms and test-retest will be relevant. And it's internal consistency that's generally reported in published studies to show reliability, but it does have its limitations. So items that are worded very similarly will yield a very high Cronbach's alpha, but they may not cover the whole content domain. So this is an issue of what we call content validity. So if I were developing, let's say, a measure of depression, I feel sad, I feel depressed, I feel blue, I feel unhappy. They're essentially asking the same thing, so they'll be completely redundant. But there might be other aspects of depression that I perhaps haven't sampled from. So don't be fooled by a very high reliability coefficient and assume, that's it, my job's done, I can use that scale for my survey. Remember, internal consistency is about how similar the items are, or homogeneity. But it's possible for a scale to be tapping two very similar traits, and so high internal consistency doesn't guarantee you have a unidimensional scale. And if your scale is multidimensional or heterogeneous, this will naturally lower internal consistency. So you might want to consult other lines of evidence, like maybe test-retest. And for those who are doing qualitative research, or perhaps you've just got some open-ended questions that you want to code, or some responses, we have inter-rater reliability. And this is particularly important, I think, for the org site people when you're considering employee evaluations. The way that they evaluate, you might want to have multiple scorers. So the degree to which two or more scorers correlate in measurement. So it's useful when observing behaviour, so how people perform, or written responses that may be subjective. So the scoring criteria used by everyone has to be clear and unambiguous, and the judges need to be highly trained. That minimises your subjectivity. And that's measured with the inter-rater reliability coefficient called Cohen's kappa. That funny little K there. So consider the example of a class lab report, or an assignment, and the process of moderation. Tutors and lecturers might mark a randomly selected bunch of assignments to ensure consistency. Some person might be too harsh, another too lenient. If the kappa is low, then we need to retrain the scorers, or perhaps change the scoring system to reduce that subjectivity. So this is just a summary of different types of reliability. Note that reliability applies to multiple methods here. So if it's test-retest, you have a minimum number of testing sessions of 2, and you would use your correlation here. The primary source of error, though, would be in the administration if something differed across the testing settings, or if the trait that you're measuring is unstable. Alternate or parallel forms, that's consistency across versions. So that applies more to the test construction. Internal consistency, well, that's consistency across elements or items in a scale on your survey. And the primary source of error here is going to be in the test construction or the survey wording. So you could use the split half reliability, but generally we'll go for the Cronbach's alpha. And if you've got any degree of, behavioural observations, if you've got any open-ended responses or anything that's subjective, then you have inter-rater reliability, Cohen's K. Now, I'm just going to very briefly brush through this because I think most people understand classical test theory, but your observed score here is the product of your true ability or your true latent trait, if it's a personality scale, and error. And there's very many several sources of error. So I want you to imagine for a moment, we're administering a survey. I've got here as a test of ability, but it could just as easily be a test of personality. We administer the test to Jane 100 times and graph the distribution of observed scores as a histogram. What might it look like? Well, we've got a few assumptions for the thought experiment. Her trait or her personality is stable, so there's no practice effects. And we have sufficient parallel forms of the test, or we do a mind wipe so Jane doesn't remember the answers. Remember Men in Black? Okay. So this would be the distribution of her scores. Assuming her true personality trait is fixed, then all of the variation we see here is just error. See how it remembers our old friend, the normal distribution. So in any survey, you need to consider the standard error of measurement. So it's a tool to estimate the degree of error associated with an observed score. It applies to ability tests, test of personality, test of attitudes, beliefs, any types of survey. It's also referred to as the standard error of the score, or by this symbol here, sigma measured. And here's the formula. I don't expect you to really remember it, but just know that it's the product of your reliability here. So as the reliability goes up, the standard error of measurement goes down. So suppose our standard deviation is 10 and our reliability coefficient is 8.6. We'd calculate our standard error of measurement and it's 3.74. Had it been 0.68, we would get a much larger value here for the SEM. Why is that important? Well, we know a few things about the normal distribution. Approximately 68% of scores will fall within one standard error of the mean. 95% of scores fall within 2, and 99 within 3. So we often construct confidence intervals around an observed score. Increasingly, there's an APA requirement to not only report your effect size, but also to report your confidence intervals. And if the confidence intervals of two groups overlap, then there's no significant difference between them. And it provides the reader with an estimate of the degree of imprecision associated with the score. So if you're using an off-the-shelf instrument, you might want to check the standard error of measurement or the reliability coefficient to see whether it's suitable for your survey. I'm going to give you an example here. Jack's observed score is 50 and the SEM score of the test is 5. I've picked easy numbers. 2 times 5 is 10, so it ranges from 40 to 60. Now that's for an individual score, but you would do this for your overall sample or for your particular subgroups in the sample. Why do we need to know this? Now, I understand stats isn't for everyone, but since reliability influences the standard of error of measurement, a low reliability test means increased SEM and wider confidence intervals. Highly reliable means tighter confidence intervals. So here's a quote here, and it's rather elegant language, so I always like to include that when I'm talking about reliability here. And this was from Cronbach, and he said, even those investigators who regard reliability as a pale shadow of the more vital matter of validity cannot avoid considering the reliability of their measures. So no validity coefficient, no factor analysis can be interpreted without some appropriate estimate of the magnitude of the error of measurement. And I think the elegance of the language will probably hammer it home to you that we really do need to pay attention to reliability and not just skip over straight to validity. For the individual, client or patient, employee, if it's the employee performance rating, it leads to a more accurate assessment of the condition. For an experiment, which generally is what we're doing here, a survey to test some hypotheses, maybe you're comparing groups or looking for an association, it means you have greater statistical power to determine group differences or if an association is present. And that's why reliability matters. Now, validity is an interesting concept. Validity is the extent to which a test measures what it claims to measure. That was the argument proposed by Nunnally in 1967. There are an awful lot of tests out there, and personality scales and psychological instruments that do not adequately measure the construct of interest. They measure other things as well, so they introduce imprecision. It's conceptually different from reliability, which was only about consistency. Validity adds an extra property, which is whether it's accurate and hits the target. So reliability is an important prerequisite, as Cronbach argued, but it doesn't guarantee the test hits the mark. Without validity, we have a collection of survey items that are meaningless. Worse still, it could be dangerous, because we might form the wrong conclusions. So consider the example of a job seeker applying for an important position. They set a screening test or a personality interview, a personality questionnaire to see if they get an interview. Unless the test adequately measures potential, we might exclude some really good candidates. That's what we call a false negative. Or if the personality test ends up hiring really bad ones, so it fails to detect that psychopath that is going to rob and steal from the company, well, that's a false positive. So survey scales are designed for a specific purpose. Example, measuring an ability, a personality trait, and they're validated for specific types of samples. Primary school children, adults. Give the same scale to a different type of sample, it may not be a valid measure, so it might be too easy. You'll have a ceiling effect. Also important to consider is the context of survey scales. Measurements in laboratory settings using rather abstract tasks often lack ecological validity. That purports to measure a construct in a particular place and time. This is one of the real advantages of surveys. They complete it generally in their own environment, and you try to make the items relevant to the organisation or the clinical sample that you're actually recruiting. But it's particularly important concerns whether the test or the survey items were generalised to other times and places. So can you generalise from one organisation to another? For example, a self-report measure of assertiveness, will it predict behaviour in the real world? Or will it just predict how they will answer filling out an online survey? Now, scale developers should present multiple lines of evidence for validity of a test. As a scale consumer, you should critically evaluate it. Scale validity evidence starts with the initial scale development paper, but it's conditional. Psychometric soundness is an evaluation of reliability and validity evidence, and it builds over time. It's cumulative, often in additional research papers that are sometimes independent of the test developer, who obviously has a vested interest in making the test look as good as possible. So sometimes people will do a factor analysis of an existing scale. If you find you're not getting the data you would like in your survey, you might do a factor analysis of one of the scales that you use to just verify that it really was measuring what it claimed to measure. But what if you're creating a brand new scale for your survey? Well, here's when you need to consider how you're going to gather evidence of the validity of the scale. Otherwise, all that time and effort that you put into data collection might well be wasted, and your research sadly ends up in a file drawer collecting dust because it won't even pass peer review, and then no one will ever read it. Now, increasingly savvy peer reviewers will check your reliability evidence and will want some degree of validity evidence. So if coming up with a new scale for your survey, consider co-administering existing ones. If not, then you need to consider additional lines of evidence you can present. One thing that is really important, particularly when you're coming up with new survey items, is face validity. Face validity describes whether the items on the test appear to the test taker to be measuring what they are claiming. So here's an example from the DAS-21. I couldn't experience any positive feeling at all. That's not going to seem that unusual to a potentially depressed person. Were you to ask them about their level of libido and sexual interest, that might seem a bit out there, and they might feel very uncomfortable because they don't know that that often is affected by depression and particularly some of the antidepressant medications. So if people doubt the face validity of your items, they're less likely to complete them, or they're more likely to leave an item blank or just stop altogether, not fill out it. Note that this is about the perception of the test taker or the end user, like your commissioning organisation. So a lack of face validity might undermine their confidence about the test or the scale. It might undermine people's motivation to answer completely honestly, or even finish the questionnaire, and that would be bad. Not all tests, though, need to have face validity. Sometimes we really do want to obscure the intent of the instrument to reduce what we call social desirability bias, or for other reasons. A good example is the MMPI-2 instrument, which the clinical folks will all know about. The org psychs probably not, but it has good criterion validity with mental health diagnoses, but very low face validity. The intent of the items is obscured. And that's important because it makes it harder to fake being well, or in the case of malingerers, to fake being unwell. I'll give you some examples, just the first 6 items. They're widely available on the internet, so there's really no test security issue in showing you the sample. So I like mechanic magazines, I have a good appetite, I wake up fresh and rested. I think I would like the work of a librarian. It's very hard to actually tell what these items are measuring. And what we do is we'd group clusters of them together, and there might be some items that would indicate that someone's particularly unwell, or they have a certain personality trait, or that will predict their job performance. So there's three categories of validity evidence, and we call this a Trinitarian view. There's content validity. How comprehensive is the coverage of the items on the test scale? So if we were doing a mid-trimester exam, does it draw on weeks 1 to 4, or only weeks 2 and 3? If we're doing a measure of a personality trait, does it measure it comprehensively? Then there's criterion-related validity. So how well does our test correlate with an external criterion? So does an employee screening test predict actual job performance? Does your survey measuring a particular personality trait measure some external outcome? Like, I don't know, life satisfaction or something like that. Then there's construct validity. So how well does our test or survey correlate with other similar measures? So the Beck Depression Inventory, if we want to include that on a survey, versus the DAS-21. Or with constructs that are theoretically related. So we call this the nomological network. So content validity determines how comprehensive is the coverage of the scale. So how adequately do the items represent the construct domain universe? So domain sampling issue here. If it's poor sampling, then you've got incomplete coverage. And there might be some aspects of the construct that you're missing out on. Consider the construct of pessimism. You might have subdomains of cognition, so pessimistic thoughts, pessimistic feelings and behaviour. A content valid test will sample from all three areas, not just one. And the solution is to produce a test blueprint to ensure coverage. Now, content validity is demonstrated by theory, what domains are important. So that's why the construct definition or the test definition is really important. And often we have experts in the field who examine the blueprint. That's why a theoretically driven definition of the construct is crucial, not just something that you just whip up in an afternoon and throw into your survey. If you're not sure what components are important, consult the literature, see how experts in the field have defined it, borrow or pilfer from the best. Now, I would be suitably wary of picking an instrument for my survey that didn't have a theoretically driven definition. Because if you do include it in your survey, then others will be similarly wary, and the conclusions that you draw may not be accepted. Now, criterion validity concerns how well our test or survey is correlated with some external criterion or outcome, such as employee productivity or supervisor ratings. The criterion is some real-world yardstick rather than another psychological construct. In other words, does our test or our survey have predictive power? So I'm going to give you an example just taken from my area of educational psychology. Does the OP score used by Queensland school leavers predict university performance, GPA? The correlation, or the criterion validity here, is R equals 0.42. So it's a moderately sized correlation. And if we wanted to argue that the OP score is a useful one, we can. So there are two types of criterion validity. One is concurrent validity, and that's where we compare a test score or a survey scale with a criterion measured at the same point in time. So when planning, if you're going to do a new scale for your survey, you might want to consider what are some external criterions you can measure at the same time. we've got here an example that will be relevant to the clinical folks, is a test of personality disorders consistent with the diagnosis made from a structured clinical interview. Now, if it's a survey, you're not actually going to be conducting the structured clinical interview. But if you're going to be using that personality test, you want to be darn sure that it actually does correlate with the opinion of an actual psychologist or psychiatrist. So you would want to evaluate the evidence, and concurrent validity is often, widely offered in test development papers. So here's an example here from Beck and Steer on psychometric properties of the BDI. The correlation between the structured clinical interview ratings and the Beck Depression Inventory range from 0.55 to 0.96 for psychiatric patients across different samples. So that's actually a wide variability there. You might be happy with 0.55, but I'd be much happier with 0.96. So the average coefficient was 0.72. That's looking a little bit more hopeful. So the other type is predictive validity, where we compare test scores or survey results with a criterion at some point in the future. So this is useful if you're doing longitudinal data, longitudinal survey. So as I showed you before, there's the Queensland OP score, predict future performance at university. So this is commonly done by the test developer in order to demonstrate the usefulness of the test. Very simple stats. It's just a correlation between the test and the criterion. Criterion validity focuses on the relationship between scores on a psychological construct and measurable real-world outcomes. Construct validity, though, it focuses on the relationship between scores on the test, or the scale, and other theoretically related psychological constructs. For example, a test of depression should also correlate with a test of anxiety, because the literature suggests that there's a strong comorbidity. A measure of employee satisfaction should measure quite well with things like a measure of conscientiousness and achievement striving, because those types of people are more likely to be satisfied with their work. You might also see some other outcomes, so age and group differences. We would include that in construct validity as well. So generally, though, this comes in the form of the nomological network. Nomology derives from Greek, meaning laws governing the mind, so it's the law of relationships between two or more psychological constructs. So Cronbach and Meehl proposed this way to establish the construct validity. So if we have a brand new measure of depression we're coming up with, then it should correlate with anxiety positively, negatively with self-esteem, negatively with optimism. So if you're going to pick a personality scale, you would want to see what construct evidence they offered and whether they had been able to demonstrate that. I'm just going to give an example here. A honesty-humility scale really did measure honesty and humility, and that wasn't accidentally correlated with social desirability bias, for example. So construct validity is demonstrated by testing the correlation between our tests and other constructs. If they're theoretically related, we should see a significant correlation. So, just to repeat there what was on the last slide, a measure of depression shows positive correlation with anxiety and a negative correlation with self-esteem. Other ways to demonstrate construct validity that you will read about in the literature or in scale development papers, or that you might want to consider to include in your survey, is convergent validity. So if you have two measures of the same construct, then they should converge. They should have a high degree of correlation. So as an example here, the Beck Depression Inventory correlates strongly with the DAS-21. So if you were measuring a brand new personality trait or an attitude, you might want to use an off-the-shelf scale as well. Maybe your one will be a better one, but to just show that they are sort of converging. A survey that I recently did into sex role identity measures. This paper is taken from Riley, Newman and Andrews. You can see here the bivariate correlation. So we could, if I turn on my little pen pointer here, our masculinity score correlates quite strongly with, on the BSRI, with a measure on the PAQ. So they were different personality scales that measured the same construct. Similarly, for femininity, it should correlate with number 5 at a very strong level because they're essentially measuring the same construct. So convergent validity is a very powerful way to actually demonstrate this. Okay. Now, divergent validity. A test score should not correlate or should diverge with a construct that is not theoretically related. So our honesty and humility scale, it better done not well correlate with social desirability. Often we'll pick something just general like neuroticism, or agreeableness, just to show that our personality scale is measuring something different. But yes, if you're doing an honesty scale, it shouldn't have a social desirability correlation. Other ways to demonstrate construct validity. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. It's getting hoarser and hoarser. Evidence of known groups validity. So scores on a test should vary in a predictable way between groups. So scores on a measure of empathy might show gender differences. Measures of depressed mood should show different scores between depressed and healthy controls. And before you throw these scales into your survey, you want to evaluate all the evidence and make sure that you really do have construct validity. Otherwise, you're setting yourself up for a potential failure or for other people to doubt the conclusions from your research. It's also referred to as the method of contrasted groups. This is really most relevant when selecting psychological instruments for your survey, because you can administer some demographic variables to just double check that in this scale that you really do have these group differences. Or if you're coming up with a new survey items, that you really can demonstrate group differences, say, between a clinical and a control group. Other ways to demonstrate construct validity are age-related change. So if you're doing a cross-sectional study, then test scores might change over time in a predictable way. So a test of vocabulary, if you use the same items, should show an increase across each primary school grade. What's more common for the clinical folk and for organisational psych, where you're delivering an intervention, you might want a pre and a post test score. So you might see some change after a psychological intervention. Got an example here of marriage satisfaction should show an increase after a brief course of marriage counselling. Not always, sometimes it leads to a relationship breakdown. But assuming that your intervention that you're trying to champion is really beneficial. You should be able to see that change. So you might have a T1 and a T2 pre and a post. Other ways to demonstrate construct validity. Well, increasingly we move to factor analysis. So items on a test shown to highly load against one or more factors using exploratory or confirmatory factor analysis kind of suggests that it's measuring that construct and nothing else. Factors are fewer in number than the original variables or items, so the 21 items from the Depression, Anxiety and Stress Scale, or DAS, load cleanly across 3 core factors. Depression items should load against a depress factor, but not load against anxiety and stress. It demonstrates that the scale is factorially sound, but it also does permit recovery of the original relationships. So it's really just for testing the scale. And this is absolutely crucial if you're developing new survey items or a new scale. If you try to publish it, they will insist that you present a factor analysis. Even if it ends up being relegated to the supplementary materials section, they will want to see the factor loadings. And it's very rare you'll see a paper published now, even where they're only just doing 5 or 6 items, just their own unique scale. They'll insist on a factor analysis. So why use it? Well, even if you don't use it in your research project, you will encounter it in test development. So you still need to be able to read it and evaluate it. SPSS, if you have a look here under the Analyze menu, calls it dimension reduction. Can your individual items be reduced down to a single or perhaps several factors? So it really is a very important skill to pick up if you haven't already. So increasingly peer reviewers, but also your supervisors and those that commission the conduct of research, so businesses, non-governmental organisations, they will insist on factor analysis. So it's not something you can try to avoid. So it's a relatively straightforward process to perform what we call principal components analysis, or PCA, or an exploratory factor analysis, EFA in SPSS. But obviously it's beyond the scope of this lecture. There's quite a number of helpful and informative YouTube videos there to guide you through the process, and I especially recommend those by Dr. Andy Field. Most people encounter factor analysis in personality or intelligence subjects, but now it's widely used for survey development, even on things such as attitudes and beliefs. So it's increasingly being used in psychology. It's something that you'll likely need to do for your actual survey. Now, I just want to briefly cover some specific threats to validity in survey research. Surveys in particular, since they generally rely on self-reports, are prone to a number of threats to internal validity, including acquiescence bias and response sets. So they answer in a way that is either very, very quick to fill out, so selecting the middle response, or they strongly endorse everything. Inattention and distraction, which I might have hinted at in one of the previous online lectures. Social desirability bias and impression management. And this last one, which is less of a problem, I think, for individual assessment of people, but it's more of a problem for research projects and surveys where you have a large group of people with lack of self-insight, or there's overt intentional deception, particularly if the surveys aren't anonymous or they're made compulsory, which makes people question the anonymity. This can be a problem. So self-report methods. Self-report methods are very commonly employed in survey research, especially when we're assessing someone's self-concept. Self-concept is someone's beliefs, attitudes, opinions, and related thoughts. How we see ourselves may be different to how others do. So some self-concept measures are based on the notion that states and traits related to self-concept are to a large degree context-dependent, i.e. the result of a situation. So I may not have the same self-image at work that I do at home or elsewhere. And self-concept differentiation refers to the degree to which a person is similar across contexts or perceives themselves as having different concepts for different roles. So you might want to supplement your survey with informant reports. A parent, a teacher, a co-worker is really good for org-psych, or perhaps a supervisor, although supervisors may have different motives. And it might be interesting to examine the correlation between these reports in your study. Particularly useful if you're going to be thinking about actually writing this up. So I'm going to go through impression management, or the subtle art of gilding the truth. And the analogy that I like to use is of dating profiles. So impression management is selective exposure of some information, maybe false, or perhaps suppression of other information. So imagine if you're filling out a dating profile, what you might fill out. And if you're not a Tinder user, that's okay, no judgment here. But I think you've all been at least curious and probably had a look at what type of things people put on profiles, or at least done that with a friend and maybe had a good laugh over a glass of wine. So think of the things you would put on a profile that will be attractive. Fun, down to earth, kind and honest, loves the beach. They're all tired cliches that you'll encounter. Most people think they're fun. Very few people think they're boring. We have a self-enhancement bias towards thinking that we're smart. We know from our knowledge of psychometrics that 50% of people are average or below in intelligence, but yet the majority, 3/4, will see themselves as better than average. In fact, it's actually called the better than average effect. So now think of the things that you intentionally would omit from a profile. Criminal record becomes colourful character. Unemployment becomes flexible hours. Substance abuse problem becomes open-minded. Now, I'm not suggesting that everyone does this, but there is often some degree of deception involved in online profiles. But now think of a work context where you're filling out a survey. You might be motivated to present the best view of yourself. Or think of a survey where you're asked about some personality traits. You know, maybe one of the clinical students might ask those types of things. Yeah, you want to protect your self-image as well. So you might see yourself in a very different light. So there's a fine line between impression management, consciously doing it, and social desirability bias, which is often unconscious. But it basically involves putting your best foot forward. It involves a mixture of self-denial and also self-deception. So I don't actually see myself that way. So you might be wondering, can we even trust self-reports? Well, firstly, not everyone is a pathological liar or lacking in self-insight. These are somewhat extreme cases. And the cloak of anonymity makes people more open, more honest in their responses. If we're not quite sure, we can include a validity scale item to check for these. By summer in Baghdad, it's probably not true, and you could exclude any participants who endorsed that. One thing that we commonly see for this item, please circle either strongly disagree or strongly agree. If they get that wrong, you instantly junk their data. You know that it's unreliable. But sometimes the self-concept, the way that they see themselves, is more illustrative diagnostically than the actual truth anyway. So I don't want to erode your confidence in self-report measures entirely. But you do need to be aware that there may be patterns of responses that affect patterns of responses that affect how people reply. So we call these response styles. I'm going to give you an example in a moment. So it's a tendency to respond to a test item or interview question in some characteristic manner, regardless of what the content of the question is. So here's some examples of some common response styles. Social desirability responding, presenting oneself in the most favourable light. So that's under the category of impression management. Gambling or cautiousness, to guess or not guess when in doubt. You find that on a multiple choice exam. But you also have acquiescence, where they just agree with whatever propositions put forward. Or they might be contrarian, non-acquiescence. You often find, and particularly if you're asking children and adolescents, if you're asking questions about drug use or sexual behaviour, you might have the deviance response style, where they make unusual or uncommon responses. So here's an example here of a response style. They've just gone for the middle option. If you were to see that in your data, you would probably want to discount that participant. Now, it's not easy to see, though, in an SPSS spreadsheet. So sometimes you might want to just visually inspect to see if there's a pattern like this on your paper and pencil or your online survey. Or here we have the acquiescence, where they've just agreed to everything. They're not paying attention, and they're just trying to complete your survey as fast as humanly possible. So another issue is inattention and distraction. So unless you're going to personally supervise the survey completion, if you do that, anonymity goes out the window, then you really have very little control over how, when, and where participants complete a survey. So this is particularly important if you're going to use an online survey recruitment measurement. And the classical problem encountered when using subject pools is inattention. So lack of care, multitasking, they're Netflixing. Hopefully that's all they're doing, but they have the desire to quickly complete for research credit. Now, what if the effect that you're going to be studying in the literature used a convenient sample? Well, there's a chance it won't replicate. If you use a convenient sample, there's a chance it won't replicate. And so that's why we'll get on to the issue of reliability and validity in a moment. That's why we'll get on to the issue of sampling bias and sampling error in a moment. So if participants are misreading or not even bothering to read, then your carefully constructed survey, it will have dramatically lower reliability. It introduces noise into the data. It's harder to reject the null hypothesis. You have wider confidence intervals on estimates, and you generally have crap data. So that's why it's very important that you need to pay attention to your recruitment method. Are you reimbursing your participants? Are you motivating, incentivizing them to participate? Another safeguard would include the use of a capture to see if they're paying attention, or if they're just going click, 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 or perhaps an attention item, so please circle strongly disagree. Now, social desirability bias, This will vary depending on the construct of interest, but if it's anything that is socially desirable, then the items on your survey may be strongly influenced by social desirability bias. I'm going to provide an aside reading that gives you an overview of the problem and some suggested strategies. It actually has one rather far-fetched idea of hooking them up to a faux lie detector to try and increase honesty. I don't think that's very practical for a survey, but what you can do from a statistical perspective is include a social desirability scale in your survey. If they lie about one aspect, then they're likely to lie about others. So you can then statistically control for social desirability, just as you would for any other covariate like age, symptom severity, socioeconomic status, etc. Just add it as a predictor to your regression equation, even though you're really not anticipating that it will be predictive. You're just using it for statistical control. And you can also do the same with an ANCOVA analysis, add it as a covariate if you're doing like a factorial ANOVA. Lack of self-insight. This is a common hallmark of certain psychiatric conditions like the personality disorders. This lack of self-insight. So narcissism and inflated ego, they see themselves in a more positive light. Or they might have fluctuating or unstable self-image. So generally, this should be isolated responses, but if you know that you're going to be working with a particular type of population, so I'm thinking clinical, I'm also with the narcissism and psychopathy thinking managers, where you think it might be relevant, include a brief scale on your survey to identify these types of participants. You can either control for it, exclude them, or analyse them as a separate group. But there will always be people who lack self-insight, and so that's why, you never want to generalise from a sample of, a handful. You want a large enough sample size that these oddballs, and I use that term affectionately, aren't going to contaminate your data too much. They might also show up as univariate or multivariate outliers, in which case you might be able to make an argument based on their responses to the narcissism scale that they should be excluded. Now, in the next mini-lecture, we'll cover considerations of sampling bias and sampling error in survey design. This is vital information as it influences how credible your research will be, so how much stock you should place in yours or how much stock you should place in other people's research. You need to be aware of these issues when evaluating the literature. See you soon.